So imagine you're a medieval peasant, just trying to get through your day without freezing, starving, or getting drafted into some war you didn't even know was happening. Life's already tough, but on top of all that, you've got to navigate a minefield of terrifying superstitions that everyone swears are 100% true. Like, step on a crack, your mom might actually break her back. See a black cat? Better start digging your own grave. Shoes placed on a table? Invite the devil right into your house. Mirrors. Those weren't just for checking your plague makeup, they were portals to the soul. Breaking one was believed to shatter your spirit and curse you with 7 years of misfortune. Salt was like the medieval version of antivirus software. You had to throw it over your left shoulder to blind the devil sneaking up behind you. Iron objects were used to ward off evil spirits, which is why people hung horseshoes over their doors, not for luck, but for supernatural home security. And if you wore your clothes inside out by accident, good. It might confuse the fairies long enough for you to escape their tricks. These weren't just quirky beliefs people laughed about. These were rules for survival. Ignore them, and you could end up exiled, exorcised, or just straight up dead. And no, you couldn't Google whether that mole on your neighbor's face meant she was a witch. You just assumed it did, and acted accordingly. Medieval Europe was basically the golden age of irrational fears. People truly believed the world was packed with signs from God, omens from nature, and invisible creatures trying to ruin your life. And honestly, can you blame them? They didn't have science, or medicine that worked, or TikTok therapists telling them to just breathe through the anxiety. They had plagues, crop failures, and demons lurking in their chimneys. If your cow dropped dead or your bread didn't rise, it wasn't just bad luck, it was probably because you forgot to throw salt over your shoulder or greet the moon the right way. Superstitions were like medieval life hacks, except instead of making your day easier, they made sure you didn't get accused of witchcraft. Let's talk about animals, because in the medieval mind, every living creature was basically a spy for the supernatural. Cats, especially black ones, were considered bad news agents of the devil, familiars for witches, and straight-up harbingers of death. If one crossed your path, that wasn't just a weird coincidence. That was a death omen. People would literally turn around and walk miles out of their way to avoid one. And don't even think about owning a Catan less. You wanted your neighbors to accuse you of summoning demons in your free time. Dogs were a bit safer, but not by much. If a dog howled at night, it meant someone in the village was going to die. Roosters crowing at weird times, witchcraft, bats flying overhead, demonic influence. Basically, if it moved and wasn't human, it probably had a supernatural job to do. And then there were objects. Everyday things we don't even think about today were considered loaded with magical energy. Now if you're thinking, okay, but surely they didn't believe in everything being cursed. Brace yourself, because even sounds could ruin your life. Thunder wasn't just weather, it was God slamming his heavenly hammer down to punish sinners. If you stepped out on the left side, you were opening your soul to evil. Left-handedness in general was considered suspicious because the left side was associated with Satan. Your cow giving sour milk, or your bread going moldy overnight. Definitely witches. And the worst part? There was no way to prove you weren't one. If someone accused you, they could test you by tossing you into a river. If you sank and drowned, congrats, you were innocent. If you floated, you were a witch, and they'd drag you out just to kill you properly. It was a lose-lose situation where surviving proved your guilt. People were so terrified of witches that they'd carry garlic, rohan wood, or even dried toad parts as protection like cursed medieval. Left-handed people were sometimes seen as cursed, or at least unlucky. So if you happened to be naturally left-handed, your best bet was to just fake it and hope no one noticed before they accused you of being in league with the devil. And God help you if you had red hair. That was another instant red flag, no pun intended. Redheads were often viewed with suspicion, because their fiery hair was said to reflect a fiery soul, one that might be being stoked in hell. If you heard church bells during a storm, people would drop to their knees immediately and start praying like their lives depended on it because they genuinely believed it did. Sneezing. If you dreamed of falling, it meant you were spiritually weak. If you dreamed of your teeth falling out, someone in your family was about to die. Dreamed of water. That could mean a birth, or a death, or a flood. Basically, whatever you dreamed, someone could find a way to make it terrifying. And people actually kept dream journals, not for self-care but for because if a local priest or healer thought your dreams meant something evil, you could be in trouble fast. That was your soul trying to escape your body. That's why people started saying God bless you, like a tiny medieval exorcism in 3 words, and hiccups. Yeah, some folks thought those were signs that someone was cursing you at that very moment. It wasn't just your body being annoying, it was the spiritual version of getting hacked. Waking up on the wrong side of the bed was an actual concern. Even your dreams weren't safe. Medieval people believed that dreams were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from demons, sometimes from dead relatives who needed help escaping purgatory. Witchcraft, of course, was the ultimate explanation for anything people didn't understand. Crop failure, witches, miscarriage, witches. If you're wondering just how deep the rabbit hole went, let's talk animals. Medieval people didn't just believe cats were bad luck. They thought black cats were literal servants of the devil. If a black cat crossed your path, you were supposed to immediately spit over your left shoulder. That's why newborns were often wrapped in herbs like rosemary or garlic, baptized as soon as humanly possible, and kept out of moonlight. There was a very real fear that if moonlight touched a baby's face, it could make them sick or even turn them into a changeling. What's a changeling, you ask? Oh, just a fairy replacement child that looked like your baby but was secretly evil. If your kid started acting weird, crying too much, not walking soon enough, or just looking a little off, some believed the fairies had swapped your child for one of their own. The solutions: some parents would shake their babies or leave them exposed to cold, hoping to scare the fairies into switching them back. It's dark, disturbing, and tragically real. And say a prayer or else misfortune would follow you home like a tax collector with a grudge. But it wasn't just cats. Owls were considered omens of death. If one hooted near your house at night, somebody inside was probably about to die. Some folks believed frogs were actually witches in disguise, spying on you from the puddles. So if you ever wondered what paranoia looked like in animal form, it's medieval Europe. Colors had power too. Wearing green to a wedding, that meant you were inviting the fairies to come mess with your marriage. Yellow was associated with jealousy and betrayal. Red could protect you or curse you depending on the time of year. And don't even think about wearing black, unless you wanted people to assume you were mourning war, that you'd made a pact with the devil. Every piece of clothing was like casting a spiritual vote, and one bad outfit could supposedly bring ruin on your crops, your kids, or your soul. But nothing topped the superstitions around babies. Babies were fragile, and medieval people believed they were especially vulnerable to evil spirits. If you thought the changeling stuff was grim, just wait until you hear about how people tried to protect their homes. Forget locks. Medieval families would bury dead animals like cats, frogs, or even pig heads inside their walls to ward off evil spirits. These were called witch bottles or apotropaic sacrifices. And we've actually found some of them in old buildings, still sealed behind the brick and plaster. They believed the smell of decay, combined with sacred objects like nails or herbs, would create a kind of magical barrier. Because apparently, nothing says no trespassing like the decomposing skull of a barn cat hidden in your chimney. It didn't stop at the front door. The threshold of a home was seen as a spiritual hotspot. To step over it incorrectly could bring disaster. That's why brides had to be carried over the threshold, not just for romance, but to avoid accidentally letting in evil spirits. If a cow gave birth to a calf with any kind of deformity, it was blamed on sin, curses, or nearby witches. And to protect their livestock, farmers would carve symbols onto barn doors, like circles, crosses, or pentagrams, not because they were satanic, but because they believed these shapes confused or repelled evil. Yes, apparently, demons were scared of geometry. And let's not forget the bells. Cows and sheep sometimes wore tiny bells, not just to locate them, but to ward off spirits who might be lurking in the fields. And if someone in the house died, you had to open a window immediately so their soul could escape before it got trapped indoors. Forgetting to do that might result in sickness, hauntings, or your cows suddenly dropping dead. Speaking of cows, medieval farmers had a whole library of weird superstitions. One of the most terrifying medieval fears was the evil eye. This was the belief that a person could curse you just by looking at you the wrong way, especially if they had blue eyes, a squint, or a birthmark. The cure? Carry iron on you at all times. Horseshoes, pins, nails, anything. Iron was believed to block the curse. Some people even nailed horseshoes above their doors, or wore small iron charms sewn into their clothes. The logic: evil can't stand the smell of metal, which, sure, makes about as much sense as fighting demons with your mom's sewing kit. Now let's talk about something that really messed with people's heads in medieval times: names. Yeah, just your name. See, back then, your name wasn't just what people yelled at you when you dropped a bucket of slop. People believed that until a child was baptized, they were fair game for the devil. Like, open season? Yes, just plain old mirrors. People genuinely believed that mirrors could trap your soul. According to superstition, if you did that alone at night, you wouldn't see your reflection, you'd see the devil himself. Or worse, your own corpse staring back at you. These were actual people who would literally eat food placed on the chest of a dead body in order to absorb that person's essence. This was a real job. Like, hey, you want to make a few coins by becoming a human spiritual sponge? They believed that when someone died, their soul couldn't move on peacefully if they still had sins weighing them down. So the sin eater would chow down on a loaf of bread or a pint of ale while hovering over the corpse. Congrats, you just digested eternal guilt. Sin eaters were basically treated like human trash cans for bad karma. And while they were tolerated, they were also totally shunned. It was like, thanks for cleansing, Grandma. Now get out of town before you curse the crops. This was supposed to be a glimpse into your death, or a cursed fate. Basically, medieval TikTok dares were hard. Forget Bloody Mary, this was full witness your doom energy. Some people even avoided mirrors completely after dark. You weren't vain, you were cautious. So if someone died in the house, every single mirror had to be covered immediately, or their spirit would get stuck staring at themselves for all eternity. That's right, if you didn't throw a towel over the bathroom mirror fast enough, your dead uncle might be doomed to spend the afterlife photobombing your morning routine. Oh, and breaking a mirror. That wasn't just unlucky, it was a full 7 years of misery. Why? 7? Because that's how long it supposedly took your soul to regenerate after being fractured. They didn't have soul insurance back then, so that was a pretty serious hit. And just imagine trying to explain that one to your landlord. No, I didn't just break the mirror, I fragmented my soul. My bad. If you so much as whispered a name before the holy water hit, the devil could snatch them up, or worse, they'd be replaced by a changeling. And if you don't know what that is, congrats. UV probably never had to deal with the horror of waking up next to your baby and wondering if it is suddenly an ancient fairy creature in disguise. Because yes, that was a very real fear. Parents would watch their kids like hawks for signs they were secretly swapped by fairies, things like not crying enough, crying too much, or making eye contact too confidently. Basically, if your baby wasn't perfectly average, it might be an undercover elf. There were even rituals to test this, like sticking the baby in the fireplace for a reaction. Don't worry, they usually didn't actually burn them, just startled them. Still, not exactly a modern parenting technique. It was believed to hold actual power. The idea was that knowing someone's true name gave you control over them, which meant that if a stranger came snooping around asking, "What's your name, good sir?" you weren't just wary because of social anxiety. You were scared they might actually curse your soul. That's why people had to use names or nicknames to throw off evil spirits or jealous witches. Think of it like having a medieval burner identity. There are even stories of people going by animal names like hound or goose in public, just to confuse demons or nosy. Basically, medieval peasants invented the original witness protection program, except instead of mob bosses, it was evil spirits and curses. And speaking of names, don't even think about naming your baby before it was baptized. Let us pivot for a second to something that's somehow both completely innocent and deeply terrifying in medieval logic: mirrors. And for the love of all things medieval, do not look into a mirror by candlelight. But wait, it gets even weirder. Ever hear of senators? Now let's talk about something that really messed with people's heads in medieval times. Yeah, just your name. See, back then, your name wasn't just what people yelled at you when you dropped a bucket of slop. It was believed to hold actual power. People genuinely believed that mirrors could trap your soul. According to superstition, if you did that alone at night, you wouldn't see your reflection, you'd see the devil himself, or worse, your own corpse staring back at you. This was supposed to be a glimpse into your death, or a cursed fate. Basically, medieval TikTok dares were forget Bloody Mary, this was full witness your doom energy. Some people even avoided mirrors completely after dark. You weren't vain, you were cautious, so if someone died in the house, every single mirror had to be covered immediately, or their spirit would get stuck staring at themselves for all eternity. These were actual people who would literally eat food placed on the chest of a dead body in order to absorb that person's sins. This was a real job. Like, hey, you want to make a few coins by becoming a human spiritual sponge? They believed that when someone died, their soul couldn't move on peacefully if they still had sins weighing them down, so the sin eater would chow down on a loaf of bread or a pint of ale while hovering over the corpse. Congrats, you just digested eternal guilt. Senators were basically treated like human trash cans for bad karma, and while they were tolerated, they were also totally shunned. It was like, thanks for cleansing grandma, now get out of town before you curse the crops. That's right, if you didn't throw a towel over the bathroom mirror fast enough, your dead uncle might be doomed to spend the afterlife photobombing your morning routine. Oh, and breaking a mirror. That wasn't just unlucky, it was a full 7 years of misery. Why? 7? Because that's how long it supposedly took your soul to regenerate after being fractured. They didn't have soul insurance back then, so that was a pretty serious hit. And just imagine trying to explain that one to your landlord. No, I didn't just break the mirror, I fragmented my soul. My bad. The idea was that knowing someone's true name gave you control over them, which meant that if a stranger came snooping around asking, "What's your name, good sir?" you weren't just wary because of social anxiety. You were scared they might actually curse your soul. That's why people had to use names or nicknames to throw off evil spirits or jealous witches. Think of it like having a medieval burner identity. There are even stories of people going by animal names like hound or goose in public, just to confuse demons or nosy. Basically, medieval peasants invented the original witness protection program, except instead of mob bosses, it was evil spirits and curses. And speaking of names, don't even think about naming your baby before it was baptized. That was a massive no. People believed that until a child was baptized, they were fair game for the devil. Like, open season. If you so much as whispered a name before the holy water hit, the devil could snatch them up, or worse, they'd be replaced by a changeling. And if you don't know what that is, you've probably never had to deal with the horror of waking up next to your baby and wondering if it is suddenly an ancient fairy creature in disguise. Because yes, that was a very real fear. Parents would watch their kids like hawks for signs they were secretly swapped by fairies, things like not crying enough, crying too much, or making eye contact too confidently. Basically, if your baby wasn't perfectly average, it might be an undercover elf. There were even rituals to test this, like sticking the baby in the fireplace for a reaction. Don't worry, they usually didn't actually burn them, just startled them. Still, not exactly a modern parenting technique. Let us pivot for a second to something that's somehow both completely innocent and deeply terrifying in medieval logic. Mirrors. Yes, just plain old mirrors. And for the love of all things medieval, do not look into a mirror by candlelight. But wait, it gets even weirder. Ever hear of... Now let's talk about plants. Innocent, leafy, minding their own business plants. To us, herbs are something you sprinkle on pizza. Hawthorn trees, for instance, were said to be sacred to fairies, and cutting one down could bring death upon your family. Entire roads were rerouted to avoid chopping them down, no joke. Witchcraft wasn't just a fantasy novel trope, it was a full-blown legal threat. People believed witches could curse your crops, kill your cows, and make your bread fall flat all with a glance or muttered word. And if something bad happened in your village, you'd better hope you weren't the grumpy neighbor, because guess what? That made you suspect number one. There are documented cases of people being accused of witchcraft because they had a birthmark, or because they kept to themselves, or because they owned a cat that looked at someone funny. Trials involved all sorts of scientific methods, like the swimming test. If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, congrats, you were innocent but also drowned. It was a lose-lose situation designed by people with zero chill and a very creative imagination. There is even a case in Ireland where a highway was delayed for years because of a lone fairy tree. People believed that witches could transform into black cats, or use them as demonic familiars. So if your cute little house cat happened to be a shade too dark and wandered into the wrong village, that was bad news. Entire cat populations were wiped out in some areas due to these beliefs, which fun fact may have contributed to increased rodent populations and worse plagues. Irony. Thy name is Superstition. Sure, they're poisonous in real life, but in medieval times they were also believed to connect the world of the living and the dead. Cemeteries were full of them, not just for aesthetics, but because people thought the trees helped souls pass over. Basically, your local landscaping decisions could summon spirits if you weren't careful. To a medieval peasant, they were full-blown magical weapons. Certain herbs were believed to ward off evil spirits, protect against witches, or even guarantee fertility. Take rue, for example. Peasants would hang bunches of it above their doors, convinced it kept out the devil. It also supposedly protected against poison, which made it kind of the medieval version of an all-in-one health supplement. Then there was St. John's wort, which wasn't just a tongue twister. It was hung in windows to ward off demons and nightmares. People legit believed that some plants screamed when you pulled them from the ground. Mandrakes were notorious for this. The myth said if you yanked one up without preparation, it would shriek so loudly it could kill you. So people would tie the root to a dog, cover their ears, and let the poor dog do the dirty work. Sorry, Fido, your medieval job was botanical sacrifice. But while herbs had their protective charms, there were plenty of plants you absolutely did not want to touch, because some were believed to be cursed. Then there was the moon. People today might check the lunar phase for fun, but in medieval Europe, the moon controlled everything. Crop yields, childbirth, haircuts, tooth extractions, name it. It wasn't just superstition. Entire calendars were built around lunar cycles. Full moon, great time for planting certain crops. Waning moon, perfect for trimming your toenails so they don't grow back cursed. And don't even think about getting married during a new moon, unless you wanted a relationship filled with tragedy and flat beer. Some medieval physicians believed the moon could influence bodily fluids, so treatments had to be done when the moon was in the right house, or else the patient might spontaneously combust. And werewolves? Oh, they were 100% real in people's minds. A full moon wasn't just romantic, it was a public safety warning. But for medieval peasants, the biggest fear wasn't monsters or demons, it was being accused of being a witch. And remember those black cats we mentioned earlier? Yeah, they were practically feline fugitives during the Middle Ages. Now, if you were really unlucky in medieval Europe, you didn't just get accused of witchcraft, you got hit with something called the evil eye. This was basically the medieval version of a passive-aggressive curse. You'd think parents back then would just name their kids something nice and move on. Nope, naming a child was like walking through a minefield of superstitions. If the wind changed direction too quickly, it meant witches were flying overhead. These superstitions came from a desperate need to understand a world that constantly tried to kill them. Famines, wars, and whether that changed on a dime. When there's no science class or WebMD, you find answers wherever you can. That rustling in the woods? Could be the wind. Could be a demon. Better sprinkle some salt, just in case. These weren't just quirky stories, they were survival strategies cloaked in mystery and passed down like sacred family recipes. And honestly, some of them, like not trusting a crow, staring at you too long, still hit a little too close to home. If there was lightning without thunder, that was God aiming at someone specifically. And rainbows weren't just pretty, they were divine warnings. Like clean up your act or enjoy the next flood. Even animals were consulted like four-legged meteorologists. If your rooster crowed at the wrong time of day, that was bad. If cows lay down at noon, a storm was coming. If dogs howled at night, pack your bags, because that meant someone nearby was going to die. And heaven help you if you saw a white owl. White owls were the medieval version of an alarm siren. You'd better start praying or running, preferably both. First off, names were often recycled from recently deceased relatives, because it was believed the spirit of the dead could offer protection. But not to recently you didn't want to anger a soul who hadn't settled down in the afterlife. Second, if your baby was born during a thunderstorm, under a full moon, or while a rooster crowed congrats, your kid might be cursed. People sometimes name their children weird things on purpose to confuse evil spirits. There are actual records of babies named Nanam or Ugly, because parents thought demons would skip over a child that didn't sound worth bothering. That's medieval parenting for you. Protect your kid by giving them the emotional damage, right from the cradle. People believe that just by looking at you the wrong way, especially if the person had blue eyes or a squinty glare, they could ruin your life. The idea wasn't just that ghosts existed, but that they were incredibly nosy. They could show up at your dinner table, rattle your shutters, or even slap you in your sleep if they felt disrespected. And forget moving on. After death, if you didn't get the right funeral prayers, you were basically a free-range phantom. That's why there were elaborate rituals for burying the dead, complete with candles, incense, and sometimes a coin placed on the tongue to pay the death toll. To the afterlife, there is even a documented superstition that if you dropped a spoon in your kitchen and it landed handle down, a spirit was nearby. That meant a man would visit. Drop a fork, a woman. Drop all three at once. Either your house was haunted, or your cutlery drawer was cursed. Crops would fail. Your cow would stop giving milk. Your child would get sick, and your bread definitely going to rise weird. To fight off this invisible glare of doom, peasants carried all kinds of charms. You might wear a tiny pouch of herbs, an animal tooth, or even a severed weasel's paw. Some people hung old shoes in their chimneys or nailed horseshoes above doors because, for some reason, metal bent into a U shape was thought to stop evil eyeballs in their tracks. Even garlic was used not just for seasoning, but to repel curses. Basically, medieval homes smelled like someone tried to exorcise a salad bar. And speaking of curses, let's talk about naming babies. Then there were the ghosts. Medieval folks were obsessed with them, but what really took things to another level were the weather superstitions. Forget the weather. Absence had vibes. And yet, despite all these bizarre beliefs, medieval people weren't stupid. But not all superstitions were born from fear. Some were downright wholesome, like the belief that sneezing was a moment when your soul tried to escape your body, so people would rush to say God bless you, not to be polite, but to literally save your soul. Superstitions explained things that didn't make sense, gave people a sense of control in a chaotic world, and created shared rituals that helped communities bond. They were kind of like medieval WFE connecting everyone, even if nobody really knew how it worked. Sure, it meant sometimes people were terrified of frogs or built their entire morning routine around the position of the moon. But hey, we still knock on wood and avoid walking under ladders. Are we really that different? Or the idea that bees could understand human language, so you had to inform them if someone in the household died. If you didn't, the bees might abandon their hive in grief. Yeah, people were writing eulogies for insects before it was cool. And let's not forget the superstitions around love. If a girl wanted to see her future husband, she'd walk backwards around a church at midnight holding a candle and a mirror. What could go wrong, right? Just casual witchy cardio in the name of romance. Spoiler, most of them just saw their own terrified reflection, screamed, and ran home. And the thing is, these strange beliefs weren't just random quirks, they shaped how people lived, what they wore, how they built their homes, even how they interacted with neighbors. So next time your phone dies mysteriously or your cat stares at nothing for too long, maybe take a second before brushing it off. After all, if you'd lived in the Middle Ages, that might have been a warning from beyond, a sign from a witch, or just your neighbor's rooster being a little too dramatic again. Medieval people may have feared shadows and curses, but in their own strange way, they were just trying to make sense of the unknown, same as we are now, just with more garlic, fewer vaccines, and a deeply suspicious attitude toward owls.